I started my frontal view skull drawing with sighting. The width to height proportion of the skull came out about 1 to 1.5. So I drew the rectangular shape that shows the proportion of 1 to 1.5. I drew in the cranium mass, and I'm working on the eye socket right now, which are located here. The height of the eye socket measures about 1/2 of the third line that I marked earlier. Eye socket looks sort of like a small rectangular shape with rounded corners, a little bit like a shape of a TV screen, and tilted slightly sideways and following the contour of the roundness of the skull. This may be a good chance for you to observe the specific characteristics of the eye socket. And then about halfway down from the top of the eye sockets would be the tip of the nasal bridge that has about the same height as the eye socket. So the measurements goes down to the base of the nasal cavity. Now draw in the nasal cavity. As I measure the top of the upper tooth, which goes here, I notice the nasal cavity needs adjustments, which happens often when you draw from observation. So I make it a little bit shorter. Extended from the zygomatic bone is the rows of tooth that takes about between the space of middle up to eye sockets. I do not have to draw individual tooth, and I just marked the top and base of the rows of the upper and lower teeth. Then I would complete with the lower parts of the jawbones. Jonah is here sitting for us to pose for a frontal view of the portrait. I used the frontal skull drawing that was just completed. The skull drawing was grayed down to a middle tone from rubbing with the chamois skin earlier. Just as the width to height proportion of the skull, Jonah has 1 to 1.5 width to height proportion, so it is perfect. I would ignore the skull drawing and pay attention to Jonah's dimensions and the proportions. First thing I do is the eyes. Jonah's eyes are located about halfway between the top of his head and the base of his chin. Jonah has big eyes here with the lines above. I would draw the eyes and mark his irises. And then I would draw the nose. I might have mentioned earlier in my other video that it would be convenient if you would consider the shape of nose as a simple block of planar wedge shape rather than as contour lines. So I measure the length of his nose and see where the base of the nose goes, from the center corners of his eyes to the base of the nose, compared to the eyes to the chin, which comes out to about 2.5 length of his nose to the chin. The shape of the nose is a wedgie-like shape with the nasal bridges here, and then the tip of the wedgie shape would be the tip of his nose right here. The sides of his nose line up with the corners of his eyes, and then tip of the nose is here. And when I draw the sides of the nose here. We just turned off one of the overhead lights, and now Jonah is getting a little bit directed side lighting, and we can see the better light and dark contrast. So immediately I see the shadows on the side of his nose. The center of the nose stands out as the lighter plane, and the base of nose where his nostrils are turns away from the light source and appears a bit darker. There is a little bit of a character in this corner by the nasal bridge, and then I can line up with two corners of the eyes to find the shape of the eyebrows. That sort of works perfectly with Ralph's structure. Eye socket, right above the eye socket where the protrusion is. And I also recognize the zygomatic bone on skull structure fits perfectly with Jonah's cheekbone, which is really helpful too. And then I would usually go for the line that represents the opening of the mouth. Note that everyone has a slightly different shape in the contour of the opening. And I would measure from the base of the nose to the opening of the mouth and compare this measurement to the measurements to the chin. So whenever I draw in any new elements, I would compare those two other elements that are already in the drawing so they maintain a good proportion and are relevant in a whole facial structure. Philtrum sets the central axis of the face. I see the shadow casted from the nose, and then the upper and lower lips are drawn in. Upper lips are facing down, usually turning away from the light source, and so it's dark. And lower lips would face up and gets the light. So usually has a lighter planes. Then right underneath the lower lips gets the darker plane again, facing down. And then the chin usually face up because there is a little protrusion at the end of the mandible and gets the highlight. And then you see the under chin, so plane that's facing down and connects the facial features to the neck. I trace the contour and see the cheekbone here. I see the darker planes that turns away from the light source, so I block in with the charcoal marks to make it darker. Note that the cheekbone here and then under chin are those bony landmarks that are getting the highlights. I usually measure the distance from the eyes to the edges of the face where you see his left ear. The top lines up with the eyes and the base probably with the mouth as a way to find the location and the scale of the ears. And I draw in the ears in that place. Then I see a little bit of hair in front of the ear here too, and I draw that in. And then forehead is really important. I'm going to measure the space from the midpoint where the eyes were drawn in here to where the hair starts, and that is compared to the space between the eye to the mouth here. And I draw the other ear that is located on the other side, symmetrical place and shape of the ear. And then he has that hair dropped in the forehead. I try to see the overall big block of the shape without getting into too much detailed or smaller areas, individual strands or hair and things like that in the beginning. So I block in with the darker marks to the whole block of the hair. I hold my pencil like a plumb line to see where the neck and the neckline of t-shirts are lined up with, using siding again to see where the pit of the neck, the base of his neck is. The shoulder point starts around someplace here, and then I see the dip of the t-shirt's neckline, starting from the shoulder to the pit of the neck and continue to the opposite side of the shoulder. Now that I completed the line drawing of Jonah, I shimmy down the drawing to gray middle tone in order to see bigger planes based on the shapes that appear lighter or darker than the middle tone of the paper. Then I would pick up an eraser to erase out, to bring out the highlights on Jonah's face. Remember the bony landmarks that we discussed earlier would get the highlight, catch the light. Right above the eye socket where there's a little protrusion is also the shape right above the eyebrow. There is a nasal bridge here, and then there is a little bit lighter shape on the forehead. Accurate proportion and the shape of the forehead contributes to capturing the likeness of the sitter a lot more than we think. So we do not want to overlook the importance of the forehead in portrait drawing. And then, of course, top ridge, top of the nose, tip of the nose, and the size of the nose as well. Then the upper eyelids get the highlight. Right above the upper lip where the round row of upper teeth are creating a up plane and round shape of a plane that usually catch the highlight. Upper lips turns away from the light source and usually appears darker, and again, the lower lip usually catches the highlight again. Then our cheekbone, zygomatic bones, and the planes that are adjacent around this area gets the highlight. Tip of the chin, right before the plane moves into the under chin, also turns upward and gets the highlight as well. Seemingly unimportant shapes as these make a big difference when you can observe really carefully. Once you've got the bigger planar block shape of the head, now you can go ahead and work on details such as the darker shapes of the iris as Jonah's. Usually eyelashes come out straight towards at us. We see a little bit darker shadows here, so I might darken the contour of the upper side of the eyes. Then I can kind of continue working to develop a little bit more on the portrait drawing. So now I think you have some pretty good ideas on how you can turn your skull drawing into a portrait drawing. Let's get started.